I welcome everyone. This is a presentation on how do I qualify for the 2023 Boston Marathon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Reem, Jishi, and I'm a coach with the Run Formula and Outrival Racing, also the operations director of the Run Formula. So we are going to get started. Presentation overview. So these are the basic things I'm going to go through today. I'm going to start by just doing a review of the current qualification standards for Boston, and then talk about the factors to consider in picking a qualifying race. And these are going to play out differently depending on who you are and your race preferences. And then I'm going to walk through my top 10 qualifying races, and these are just spring and summer races because anything that's already happened is sort of too late to talk about, but there's still quite a few races that are in the mix for 2023. And so I have my top 10, and then I also have another 10 honorable mention races that I'll mention, and then finishing off with some race day tips. So now you picked your race, you're set to go. What are the things that you can do on race day to maximize your time on that day? Okay, so just setting the stage, the Boston Marathon, April 17th, 2023, and you can participate by qualifying, or there's some other ways that you can do the race. The biggest other one is for charity, or you can be an invited runner. For qualifying races, we know so far that any race that's run September 1st, 2021 on is a qualifying race. What we don't know yet is when the qualification period finishes. That's an unknown. In the past, historically, not counting 2021 and 2022, the closing window tended to be in like middle of September of the following year. So the timing is when the close of registration is. So registration will open sometime in 2022 in September, usually the second week of September, and it will stay open. Historically, it's been open for 10 days, but last year it was different. And so we don't really know right now what the end date is, but the guess is it'll be sometime through mid-September. It could potentially for, sorry, just trying to let someone in here. For the 2022 race, registration stayed open until November 12th, 21, but that was on a really different schedule. So the answer is that we don't know. So with these ones, I'm going to focus for the most part on the races that are in March to early September for possibilities. So I should mention too, if you have any questions along the way, if you can, best option is to just put them in the chat box, and I will, at the finish of the presentation, I'll go through and try to answer any questions that you may have. And I'll also open it up at that point if you want to ask them live. Okay, so next, so here are your current qualifying standards. They are done by age and also by male, female. These numbers are the numbers that were put in place for 2020 for the first marathon that didn't happen, but they are put in place. That was a drop of 5 minutes from immediately previous, although the numbers have gone up and down over the years. But these are the current numbers that you're looking at for 2023. One thing to note here is that just because this is the number that you see on the screens here are the numbers that you need to apply for the Boston Marathon. This is the heartbreaking thing that's happened to a lot of people over the years, is that they hit the number, they say I qualified for Boston, and then more people apply than there were spots available. And I'm going to go through, I think on the next slide, we'll walk through what the numbers have been under in past years. But if you hit these times, that gives you the right to go ahead and apply for the race. Okay, so this is just some historical numbers here. So if you look here, this is 2019. The numbers were 5 minutes slower. And this is what we were looking at. You had a 30,000 person field size, and in the 30,000 in general, about 80% of those are qualified runners versus invited runners or charity runners. So you had 30,000 in the field, roughly 24,000 people, runners, qualified runners, and the cutoff time, you had to be 4:52 underneath the cutoff time in order to get in. So after, which left out quite a few people, almost a quarter of the people that applied did not get in that year. So they, so the BAA made the time quicker the next year in 2020. And this is these 2020 numbers of the people who applied to run the April 2020 Boston Marathon, which did not happen. So here, even though the number got quicker, even though they dropped the times, still more people applied than there were spaces for. Sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at once here. Okay, so it was 139 under, and over 3,000 people did not get in for the 2020 marathon. When it was moved to what turned out to be October of 2021, they reopened. People who had already been accepted for 2020 had to reapply for 2021. The field size was smaller by 10,000 runners. So although the qualifying time was the same as before, now a lot of people who applied for the 2021 race did not get in. You had to be 7:47 better to get in 2021. For this coming Boston Marathon, there were everyone who applied who had a qualifying time got in. So everything is a little bit unknown here. But one thing I will, as I go under here, just to break down some more here, that in 2022, just under 24,000 runners applied. And so historically, you've got 30,000 runners, 80% of them are qualifying. So they would take 24,000 runners in normal years. So it just happened to be a year. And there were a lot less qualifying races. There were smaller races, even though the window of potential qualifying races was longer for 2022, just there were less people that applied. And part of that is qualifying races, part of it, I'm sure, was the pandemic and maybe some of the additional restrictions that were put in place. But everyone who applied for 2022 got in. I think that that's not to be expected for 2023. And then if you look at the 2021 numbers, you see here, again, it's just under 24,000 people applied, but because the field size was considerably reduced, a lot of people didn't get it. So had it been a normal field size for 2021, then everyone would have been accepted and we wouldn't have had over 9,000 unhappy people. Okay, so this is 2020 is probably the most relevant year, although like I said, we don't know for sure what's going to happen in 2022 and or for 2023 and how long they'll keep open the window. But for 2020, they had 27,000 and change number runners apply, and over 3,000 were not accepted based on the applications. So and this is a breakdown of how that played out versus qualifying times. So if you look at this, more than half of the runners were within 10 minutes of their BQ time. So that tells you that how you end up racing your race on your qualifying day becomes really important, because there are 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes that can be found in races that can make the difference between making your getting into the Boston Marathon and not getting into it. All right, so this was the application timeline for 2020, which presumably is what they'll go back to, but
come on, you can come out.
We don't know for
you
sure.
Hold your belly. Good girl.
Okay, so in 2020, the application opened on the 9th of September, and they did it according to, you had 2 days if you were 20 minutes under, then 2 days if you were 10 minutes under, and then Friday of that week, if you're 5 or more minutes under, you could go ahead and apply. Registration closed And then it reopened on the next Monday for any athlete with a qualifying time. They closed registration 2 days later, and then a week later, the acceptance, non-acceptance notifications were sent out. So in this year, in 2020, any race that was run on the 18th of September or before counted as a qualifying race. So that's where we don't know for 2023 what that date cutoff is going to be. But for 2022, I think I mentioned earlier, is that the registration window closed on November 12th. So a lot of the fall races like New York City and Marine Corps that normally wouldn't be qualifying races were qualifying races for 2022. So it's an unknown. We will, Boston, the BAA will announce what the more registration details after the race this year. So moving on. All right. So now this gets into the fun part, picking a qualifying race and some factors to consider. And this is a long list, but I'm sure it's not fully inclusive of everything. But the first thing to start with when you're picking a qualifying race is to make sure it's a certified.
You don't have to turn it off. No, you don't have to.
If you are on
Listening how to get into the Boston 2023. How few people did.
If you can just check to make sure that you're on mute, unless you're going to ask questions, that would be great. So picking a qualifying race, first things, make sure it's a certified course. So it needs to be certified in the US by USA Track and Field. If it's not certified, do not sign up for that race. So make sure if you have a question, whether a course is certified, reach out to the race director. But if you go to a race that is not certified, then it's not going to count no matter what. So that's number one. To meeting other qualification criteria, and this is all up on the website, but pretty much it has to be 3 or more competitors. It has to be promoted prior to race day. So you can't just, grab a few friends and show up on race day and call it a certified marathon. It needs to be promoted in advance. It also needs to have timing devices to count. And there's some exceptions if you don't have the chips, but somewhere you need to back it up with photos, manual time or something. But basically you want something that is an official race that says that it's a Boston Marathon qualifier when you sign up for something. Okay, next thing is the date. And here you're trying to stay within the qualifying window. So for now, we'll just go on the assumption that that window is going to go through probably the second Saturday in September. But I said, we'll know more after the race this year in April. But the date, and that is, of course, also dependent on your training and when you're prepared to be running. The number of runners, and this can go different ways. Some people love big city races, love them. So they could go off the energy. They think it's awesome. They run faster. Big city races tend not to be as fast because there's so much crowding and it's hard to get into your rhythm. But this is something that you should, when you sign up for a race, you should know and make a conscious decision. I like this race because it has 500 runners or 1,000 runners or 2,000 or 50,000, whatever you like, but just think about it going into it. The weather, and this is not just, oh, well, the perfect, so ideal running conditions. I mean, generally for a marathon are somewhere around 40 degrees. Some people like upper 30, some people like up to 50, but it's a relatively cool day that's not very windy. That's perfect. But if you live in the Northeast and you've been training in the freezing cold weather and you say, hey, I want to go to Texas or Florida or Southern California for a race, you need to think about that in advance, because if you're used to training in the cold weather, you're used to training on a treadmill, then going to a warmer climate, humid race can be really difficult unless you haven't taken the time to acclimate to it. Likewise, if you live in Florida, like I do, and you go to pick a race, then when I was picking my race for this year, I was like, I can't go to a race where it might be snowing in the race because my body would go in shock with that. So weather is something important. And the next thing to consider is what type of course is it? Is it a one-way? A lot of one-way courses tend to also be downhill courses, so that's kind of nice. but they become much more logistically challenging on one-way courses. Now you're dealing with shuttle services or someone picking you up, or, so it usually makes the morning start a little earlier, makes things a little more hectic at the end of the race. Out and back races are easy to put on for the organizers because you can tend to have less stops along the way. They're kind of fun. You get to see them, but some people don't like to do out back courses. And when you know that you're not at the turnaround, you see people turning around, sometimes that's tough. So that's just something that you should think about. Looped courses, it's, that's, again, it's a preference. If you like to run on a single loop, sometimes there's double loops. Sometimes you've got other races that are running at the same time that overlap on the loops. So it's just something to know when you're looking up the races. Take a look at that and think, what kind of course do I want? What do I think is going to work best for me? And then likewise terrain. So you can have downhill courses, you can have flat courses, you can have hilly courses, you can have rolling courses. In general, your fastest race is going to be a downhill race. I mean, that just is logical. Some of the fastest times are coming from the downhill races, and I'll go through a few of the options over there. Flat races tend to be pretty quick too, but if you've got a flat one-way course and you have a headwind, then that, can play out pretty differently too. Or if it's something that's by water and you've got crosswind, then a one-way or a out and back that's on that might make it more challenging. Then road surface. So the fastest races are going to tend to be on asphalt. But there are some races that are trail races or hard packed surfaces. There are some marathons that have concrete on them, which, although a fast enough surface, is really taxing on your body. So if you tend to get maybe more easily injured, you might want to stay away from the concrete courses. So again, just something to look at. The next one is start time. And I'll go through on my list of my top 10. I'm going to give you the start times on these, but some races start at 6 a.m. and some will start. The latest one on my list, I think, starts at just after 8 o'clock. Races tend to start early because they go on a long time. It's easier to control the traffic earlier in the day. A lot of the time, just the weather is cooler earlier in the day. But if you have a 6 a.m. start time and you have a one-way course and you have to deal with a shuttle and you're at a 4 a.m. start, how does that work for your body? For people who run every day at 6 a.m. that wake up early, that's great. For people who tend to run later in the day, you might consider your start time as one of the things that you think about, because you want to run at a time that your body is working the best. And if you have a 6 a.m. race, and I recommend getting up for your long runs, the last few long runs, and doing them at that time and making sure that your body's accustomed to running at that time. Okay, so the next thing is the vibe of the race. Do you like a race that has music on the course, that has lots of people packed along the course, or do you like something that's really quiet? So again, a personal choice, but something that you need to consider. The next thing is pacers. So in a lot of races, they will set pacers up, often timed around when the BQ times are, but as said, that the BQ time and the time that you actually need to race Boston are not necessarily the same thing. So running with a pacer could prove challenging. And also pacers, some pacers are very good and some aren't. And now there's some races that aren't doing pacers just because of keeping people closer in packs. But that's something, if you want a pacer, then make sure you're looking at the race you sign up for has a pacer. The next thing is course support. And this is really important because nutrition on the course is vital. And some races have Gatorade Endurance and they have some kind of energy gel on the course. And if you've been training with those two things, that's great. Like, ideal situation is that what you've been training for is exactly what's on the course, and it's there often enough that it supports everything that you need. But there's some races that have electrolytes that are no calorie electrolytes that don't have gels on the course. And then you have to start thinking, well, how am I going to support myself here? And it's not a big deal to carry gels that you need. It becomes a lot more challenging if you have to carry powder with you and mix powder along the way, or carry your own liquid. So ideally, you look for a race that has good nutritional support on it. And then you practice with that nutrition to be ready, because having to carry your own liquid gets to be really difficult, and you shouldn't be accepting things from people outside of the race. So that's just something to think about. Logistics here, mentioned a little before, that's just stuff before the race. Is there a shuttle? How difficult is parking? Can you get a hotel that's close to the race? Those kinds of things, and you really want to know what those logistics are and think of them and have a plan before race day, so that you're really, when it's race morning, you're not stressed out about how you're going to get to the start and where you're going to find a parking spot. Big city races tend to be much more difficult logistically. Bigger races tend to be more difficult. So, a 500 person country race tends to be kind of easy for your start, but is that the right race for you? So balancing logistics with other things. The next one is concurrent races. So it's pretty infrequent that you find a marathon only on that day. So often there's at least a half marathon, potentially on top of that, a 5K and a 10K. And look at how these are run. So sometimes the race organizer will start the marathon and half marathon together, and you're running along together for 12.9 miles. And then the half marathoners turn off and finish, and the marathoners do another loop on the same course or go off and do another loop. That can be really difficult, psychologically, because you've been running with a nice group of people and then all of a sudden they disappear and you're on your own. And so that's something mentally that you have to be prepared for if that's what's going to happen. There's other races that start the half marathon like halfway through the marathon course, which at first you're like, oh, well, that seems pretty good, because then I'll have the energy. But then you realize those half marathon runners have more in them. And in those times of the race where you're struggling in the marathon, to have people pass you that are full of energy can be really difficult too. I like the ones where they have them on the course and you're not overlapping with each other somehow. They start the half marathon after somewhere, but just expect when you sign up for a race, make sure that that's something that you're looking at and that you're comfortable with the situation that you have. So that's, again, it's a type of energy and it's a personal preference, but just make that conscious decision on the preference. Next one is location. And this is, how difficult it is to get to for you. Is it a driving one? Do you need to get on a plane? Is it weather differences? Is it similar to the climate that you've been training in? Those are things to consider. And then the last one on here, COVID rules. So some races now are requiring vaccination, or they're requiring proof of a negative test. And so just know what those rules are and make a decision that that's okay or not okay with you on a race. Okay. On we go. Okay, so here is my list, and this is my list, but it comes from a number of sources. I'm doing research and from the Boston Marathon page, but this is a good place to start if you're looking for some spring races. The first number one on the list, I'm not going to spend any time talking about it, is the Boston Marathon. So that the number one qualifying race for the Boston Marathon is the Boston Marathon. But only about 20% of the runners who run Boston re-qualify off of that race, which is interesting. I mean, part of it's just getting to Boston is the exciting thing and people take it in. But part of it is that, so I told you that half of the people that are qualifying are within 10 minutes, and you can have an up or down pretty easily, a few minutes here or there, they can make the difference between qualifying or not. So that's all I'm going to say about Boston. The rest of these are coming up. The first one's in a few days. So if you're not signed up for it yet, there's probably, you're not going to want to look at that one too much, but I'm just going to walk through each of these because they're in different parts of the country and different types of courses. Okay, so the Mesa Marathon, which is in Arizona, Mesa, sorry, that's coming up in just under 2 weeks. It's an early start. It's a scenic course, point to point. It's a downhill course with a net elevation loss of 1,000 feet, downhill right at the end, mean temperature of 59 degrees. And that's the day of temperature, not necessarily the race temperature at the time of the start. It's an early start, so you get off in the cooler part of the day. So all the races that I have on my list that I found that in general, the really big races, although they have high numbers of qualifiers, don't have high percentages of qualifying. And then the races that are too small might have high percentages of qualifying, but there's a few, there's not that many runners. So depending on like where you are, like if you're sort of in the mid-range of qualifying, you might be more surrounded. But if you are a 65-year-old female, then, and there's only 75 people running, the chance of having someone that's near you becomes less likely that that's going to happen. So in general, the middle-sized races seem to hit the sweet spot the best, but do your research. It is a preference, how many people you want out there. So this one, just over 2,000 finishers. About looking at the years 2017 to 2020, the average BQ was 21%, or about 460 runners. This race was canceled in 2021, so we don't have numbers for 2021. Okay, Carmel Marathon. So this is now just under 9 weeks away. So potentially a race that you could still register for if you're looking for one. This is the latest start time of any of these, 8:10 start in Indiana, outside of Indianapolis. It's a city residential looped course. And this is one of those where they start the half marathon and the marathon at the same time and run the entirety of the first loop together before the half marathon goes off to a finish. And then the marathon goes and does a different loop for the second half of the race. Mean temperature is 47, so probably 30s in the start, pretty ideal conditions. This race, in terms of number of participants, has gone up and down over the years, from the 600s to the just over 1,000. So an average of about 900 runners, and 22% BQ for these 4 years. It was canceled in 2020, and 2021 had a 28% BQ, which is one of the highest in 2021 in terms of percentages. Okay, next one, Glass City Marathon and Toledo, Ohio. Early start time for this, 6:30 start time. It's a flat course, single loop, good conditions, mean temperature of 52, and a scenic neighborhood course. Finishers just over, so we've got just over 1,100 finishers, almost a quarter have BQ times. So pretty strong there. This one was also canceled in 2020, so we have a gap in there. Okay, next one, Eugene. This one looks like a lot of fun to me. So 7 a.m. start time, Tracktown, USA. And it's a city residential race, and it finishes on the track inside Hayward Field. So that just has got to be motivating in and of itself. Single loop course, mostly flat, some rollers, pretty good conditions temperature wise, and about 1,500 finishers, about a quarter of them qualified in 2017 to 2019. This race did not take place in either 2020 or 2021. So it's back again this year, scheduled for May 1st. And next one, Ottawa. This is the only Canadian race I have on here. May 24th, 7 a.m. start. And this is a city and residential race. Again, it's a single loop with some out and back sections. Mostly flat. This one now we're getting towards spring, later in spring, so the temperatures are going up. So depending on the day, this race could be very comfortable, or it could end up being a little warmer than most people would prefer. I have this on here. This is one of the bigger races that are on my list, and the BQ numbers are lower at about 15%. But still, because it's a bigger field, you've got almost 500 runners on average that are qualifying every year for this. Okay, Mountains to Beach. So this is in Ojai, California, Memorial Day weekend, 6 a.m. start, super easy. So this one is a gradual downhill race, point to point, scenic. So think here, 6 a.m., point to point, early start. on this one for your day. But that said, net elevation loss with a gradual decline of 700 foot to 1,000 foot elevation loss it's noticeable, but it's not going to like pound you the same way that some of the other ones are that I'll talk about here. So this is a fast race, depending on the wind direction, of course, but it's a quick race, and almost a third of the people who run this race qualify for Boston. Okay, next one, Grandma's Marathon. So now we're into June in Minnesota, 7:45 start, scenic city finish, point to point. This runs mostly along Lake Superior. Most of the course is right on the lake, and mostly flat with some rolling hills, a slight elevation loss over the course of the race, but nothing that's noticeable. Temperature could be a little warm on this one. Bigger field at more than 6,000, and the number here, it's just over 15% qualified, but the number has been higher in recent years. So it's been more in the 17 to 18% range in 2018 and 2019. It did not take place in 2020. In 2021, there was a smaller field. It was less than half. So I didn't factor those numbers into here, but the BQ percentage was about the same, about 18% in 2021. Okay, Jack and Jill's. So this one is a unique one. It takes place, you have two choices. You can run on either Saturday or Sunday. It's North Bend, Washington. It's a scenic point to point. And this one is the only one on my list that's a hard packed. It's not technical, it's not trail, but more like just a hard packed gravel. And it is a net elevation loss at 2,000 feet. That's starting to get to be a significant elevation loss. There is a tunnel in this, a 2-mile long tunnel, and this starts early, and you will need a flash headlamp on for this one. It's a pretty small race here at just about 600 runners on each day. Really high BQ percentages, so at 25%. And so between the 2 days, you get to that 1,200 number. So you've got about 300 people that are qualifying each year. This course, from what I can tell, is the same course that's there's the tunnel marathons run the same course. There's a few other tunnel races that would qualify if you like this kind of race. Those are on June 12th, August 14th, September 18th. The September 18th one's a question mark. But if you like a downhill point to point gravel type quick, but this is a quick race, then Jack and Jill's, or you can look at the tunnel races as well. Okay, the next one, the Revel races. So I have Big Cottonwood on here. High BQ percentage, September 10th. So should be a qualifying race. Can't be absolutely certain at this point, but chances are this will be. Salt Lake City, the Revel races are known for their pretty steep elevation drop. So this one is over a 5,000 foot drop, which is going to pound your quads like crazy. So if you decide to do one of these races that has a net elevation drop, which sounds like a really great idea because you're going to go a lot faster. If your quads are not strong in the lengthened position, you are going to pay, and you may make it through the race, but you won't be able to walk for 3 weeks after that. So I definitely recommend doing a lot of quad strengthening work and practicing your downhill and really making sure that your body and joints are ready for the pounding that comes with the downhill race. But that said, high qualification times on here. And so 2020 was canceled. 2021, instead of your normal 1,200 finishers, they had about 760 finishers, but BQ percentage was about the same at 22%. So there's some other Revel races. If this kind of concept of a downhill significant net elevation drop is interesting to you, you can check out there's one in Las Vegas on April 2nd and one in Colorado on June 4th. And then there's one in November. So that presumably will not be a 2023 qualifier, but there are other options in addition to this, if that's the kind of course you're looking for. Okay, last one on my list is the Erie Marathon. And the Erie Marathon is one that in years past has been a qualifier for multiple years, which is nice. But again, there's no guarantee if it is going to fall in the 2023 year or not. We don't know that yet. Historically, it has though. And 7 a.m. start. And this is a pretty quiet area. It's in the park. It's a double loop. You don't have a lot of people out there cheering you on. Works great for some people, doesn't work well at all for other people. It's very flat though. It could be warm, but if you look at the BQ numbers, they're really high in this course. So you have almost 40% of people that have qualified historically. There was no race in 2020, and 2021 was a much smaller field at almost 1,000 less runners in 2021. So not as relevant to look at, but this is another option. Okay, just quickly, honorable mention races. So these are some other ones that have pretty good qualification standards. And I'm just going to point out a couple. So I mentioned the tunnel marathons before when I was talking about Jack and Jill. So those are the ones or two options. There's the BQ2 races, and these ones there's 3 of them, 2 in the fall and 1 in the spring. And their idea of them, so when they make a September 10th, their presumption is that September 10th is going to be in your last chance to qualify in the qualifying window. And then they have the spring one that's coming up in April, and there's 2 dates in the spring. So there's basically 4 races, and these are small. They're like 500, under 500 runners, and they're looped courses. And I ran one of these. I got my BQ for the Boston that never happened at the BQ spring race. And it's kind of neat because you're like a pro that day. You get to set up your own water bottles, and they have pacers. And they set up the pacers for a minute under the newly lowered qualification time. And unfortunately, that didn't turn out to be enough that year. So a lot of people qualified. These have like 50% qualification numbers. So it's nice because that's their sole purpose. They're out there to get you to qualify for the race. But if you don't want to run a 3-mile loop over and over and over, it's not a good race for you. So, but these are some other options to look at depending on where you live and the timing of what you want. But these ones all have pretty good BQ numbers as well. Okay, so now pick your race. You trained, you're there. How do you maximize race day? So first thing is pacing. And the thing I'm going to say about this, number one, is have a plan going into it. Make sure you have thoroughly thought about what pace you want to keep, how you want to approach the race, and stick to it. Whatever it is, are you going to follow a run walk approach? Are you going to try to go negative split? Are you going to even pace it? The Find My Marathon website, you can go on there and actually create pace bands based on what your run strategy is. And they do it pretty specific per race too. So that'll tell you if you're doing a course that has some hills, that there's going to be some miles that are, even if you're trying to even pace the miles, going to be faster than others, depending on what gradient you have along the way. So the one general rule that is out there is that banking time doesn't work, and you end up losing more time than you gain. But it is a pacing strategy. So if that's what you want, but go into it intentionally. If you go in and say, I'm going to run a 7:55 pace, and your first 2 miles you're at a 7-minute pace, then you've done something wrong with your pacing strategy. You need to reset and figure out because you're not. We hope that we're going to run faster on race day we get our taper right, our nutrition's right, everything's worked out with the training, but you're not going to run a minute per mile faster than you prepare to run. So you do need to have a plan and stick to it. Pace groups are an option. And then the last thing I'll say here on this is that, are you looking to run your best race, or are you looking to run a BQ? And where I put this in is this comes into play when someone's sort of on the edge of whether they're going to qualify or not. So let's say that your training points out and says, I'm going to run about a 3:11 marathon, and your BQ time is a 3:10. So you really want to try to run, let's say, a 3:08. And how important is that BQ time for you? So are you going to, instead of running the race that you know you can run, are you going to try to run a race that maybe you can run, or maybe you'll crash and burn? And that's something you need to decide for yourself, but you need to decide that and think about that, because you could go out there and have a great, 20 miles and then just be wrecked in those final 6. And that's not ideal. It's common, but it's not ideal. But if you had paced maybe 5 seconds slower per mile, then overall you could have done better. But if your goal is Boston or bust, then you go after Boston. If your goal is, I'm going to race the best race that I can race, and if I qualify, then you run that race. So something to think about as you go through it. Next one, overrunning the course. And this is the one, it kills people. I had an athlete a few years ago that ran pace to qualify for Boston. Unfortunately, he ran 26.6 miles. So he did not qualify. He was over by less than a minute. So had he not run those extra 0.4 miles, that was about 3 minutes of time, he would have qualified. And that's pretty heartbreaking. So you want to practice this running tangents. So easy to run a straight line when it's a one-way course, or a straight out, or an out and back course or something like that. It's easy. It becomes harder when you're on a course that has a lot of twists and turns and back and forth. And so here you have to think about running the tangents. What's the quickest way to get through a corner? And there's stuff out there, you can look it up. They'll tell you the fastest, like the shortest line that you want to do, because when these races are measured for 26.2, they are measured on the shortest line. And so often you're running something that's longer, or maybe your Garmin's off and you think that you're running something that's different from what the course is. So trust the mile markers on the course. And, so ultimately you have to be able to run the time over whatever distance you run. And Boston isn't going to take your Garmin marathon. It's whatever the results are. So that's just something you really want to think about. Other places that people tend to overrun on, if you're passing runners, every time you go to jog around another runner, not only are you wasting energy with accelerations, but you're also tending to step out to the side and then step back in. And that all adds up. So at the beginning of those crowded races, you are probably picking up extra distance, a step here and a step there. And next thing you know, you've added 0.2 of a mile onto your race. So something to be aware of. And that's one of the downsides to some of the bigger races. And then the other thing is aid stations. If the aid stations are on the right, but you're spending your whole time running on the left, then every time you cut over, you've just added onto your distance. So again, something to think about as you're preparing for your race and running and setting up where you want to be. Next. Okay, other things, stops along the way. Are you going to take stops along the way? Are you going to stop at the rest stops? Are you going to walk through the aid stations? We have planned stops and unplanned stops. So if you know that you're going to walk through the aid stations, you have to factor that into your mix. And there's calculators out there that can tell you if you're going to run for 9 minutes and walk for 10 seconds, like how much faster you have to run than your average pace. And then there's unplanned ones. Are you going to have to take an unplanned walk break, or are you going to have to use a porta-john or something? Something happens out there. So stops along the way, you have to factor them in. Someone told me today, I was wearing a New York City Marathon shirt at the grocery store, and someone told me about their friend that just ran Disney that would have qualified for Boston had he not stopped and taken pictures with the characters in Disney. So, that's not a common one to hear about, but the point is, like, if you're really close and you see your family, you got to think about whether you're going to stop and give them a hug, because sometimes seconds can make all the difference. But factor in these stops along the way as you're calculating your pace. Think about that piece. Nutrition and hydration. I can't overemphasize how important this is. I said earlier on, you need to know what's on the course, you need to practice it. So, excuse me. So practice what's on the course, do your dress rehearsals, make sure you know what you're going to have for breakfast. And for anyone that doesn't have a race fueling plan, our partner company, the Core Diet, does race fueling, and it's really important before you really get into your peak training to have your nutrition hydration nailed. And then the last thing is, what happens if you get injured really close to your race? Do you race anyway? If you've missed a lot of training, do you race anyway? And think about that, because if you've missed a couple weeks of training or you're coming off an injury, you're not going to race your best race. So this is where you think, okay, maybe I need to pick another one. Maybe I need to reset here. Okay. I am done talking now. I've been going for 45 minutes here. So I'm going to turn off my share and just ask if anyone has any questions. You can put them in the chat box. You can take yourself off of mute if you want. I'd be happy to answer any questions. No one? Okay. I know I said a lot today. If you have any questions along the way, please reach out to me. You can reach me at reem@therunformula.com, and I would be happy to answer any questions. This was recorded today, and I will get it up. It'll be on the QT2 Systems YouTube page. And I hope you found it helpful. And again, please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks very much. Have a great night, everyone.